Hey guys, and welcome to another React project, a budget calculator project. And what makes this project so special is the fact that we're going to build it using only React hooks, more specifically use state and use effect hook. And during the project, not only we're going to understand the purpose as well as the syntax for both of the arguably most used hooks, but we're also going to implement them as well. So what are we going to build in this project? Well, first and foremost, our project is going to have a form. And then within the form, there's going to be two inputs, one for rent and the second one for the amount. So let's say we have a rent and the rent expense is 2000. And of course, we can just add it here. Now we're not limited to just adding one item. Could also say car payment. All right. Now my car payment is going to be, let's say, $400. The moment we click on the submit, we have two things happening. First of all, we add item to the list. And the second, we have the alert here displayed where we successfully tell the user that item has been added to the list. Now, once we add item to the list, we can also notice that our total is working, where we're going to count the total of the expenses and display it correctly. All right. Then we have few functionalities available to us. We can clear the whole list. That is always the option. We can edit the item or we can delete the single item. So I'm going to just clear the list. As you see, I have the alert where all the items have been deleted. So let's add them again, where the rent is, in this case, 2000. And by mistake, I clicked on submitting without adding the item. I notice now I have charge cannot be submitted because the item was empty. So let's go back. Let's try it again. And I can say charge can't be empty value and the amount value has to be bigger than 0. So if the user tries to add without filling out both items, well, he or she is not going to be successful. All right, let's head over back. Let's say 2000. Now the item has been again added to the list. And again, we can either edit it, clear all of them, or just delete one. So in this case, I'm going to delete one. Yes, successfully I deleted that one item. Everything is working really well. And let's just add our car, or not carry, car payment. Then let's go again with 400. Let's add this particular item and let's check it out how in fact we can edit it. Now, the moment I'm going to click on the edit button, notice now I have my car payment as well as the correct amount. And in this case, I can just change it to, let's say, 5,000. And instead of car payment, you know what? It's going to be a boat payment. Let's edit it. And notice also the moment we clicked on the edit button, also our submit button changed from submit to edit. So in this case, I can just edit. Again, I get my alert that item has been properly edited. And then last but not least, of course, I do have right now my boat payment instead of my car payment. So that's the application we're going to build. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the project and I hope to see you guys in the project. As a side note, in order to improve your experience during the project, I prepared all the CSS and stored it in the project setup files. That way you don't have to waste your time and watch me endlessly type out the CSS. Project setup files are available in my GitHub, and you can either search for them directly or just follow the link in the description. I also would like to mention that if you prefer project-based learning, be sure to check out my Udemy courses. For example, React one, where we cover not only React tutorial, but also build interesting projects using React. Assuming we are in good shape as far as the setup files go, meaning you have installed them, why don't we kick things off by bootstrapping a brand new React application using Create React App. Now I have installed it already globally, so I'm just going to run the command of Create React App and then the project name. Alternatively, you could go the npx route. All right. Now I'm going to head over to a terminal. I'm going to zoom in just so you can see a bit clearer my commands. And then first of all, let's navigate to a desktop. But as always, you can create your, in fact, project wherever you would like. And right away, I'm going to run a command of create React app. And then the project name is going to be budget calculator, like so. Now the install will take some time. So I'm going to stop the video and I'm going to resume the video once the install is complete. Now that the install is complete, before we start up our dev server, in fact, I would like to install two more dependencies. One for icons, and the package name is going to be React Icons, as well as one for unique IDs. And for that, I'm going to use a package by the name of UUID. All right. Now within the terminal, let's clear everything and let's write npm, or you know what? No, first we need to navigate to our particular folder. That was step number one. Then once I'm in that folder, then I'm going to install, in fact, my dependencies. So let's write npm install. Then we have React icons as well as UUID. And let's just add a -- save flag. And once we are installing right now these two dependencies, then in fact, I'm going to open up my favorite text editor, which is Visual Studio Code. And you know what? At this point, I think I can, in fact, close my sticky notes. Then let's drag and drop our current project right there. I'm also going to open up a new window, new browser window, just so I have my project as well as the browser side by side, like so. And then within the Visual Studio Code, we have an option of integrated terminal. And then from the integrated terminal, I'm going to run the npm start, which is going to start up my dev server. Now I'm also going to have, in fact, the React app, my finished application on a bigger browser window. And I would also like to open up the localhost 3000, where once in a while, I'm going to show you how our application, the one that we're currently building, looks on the bigger browser window. Now let's head over back to our project. Our dev server is, of course, running successfully, like you can see on a smaller browser window as well as the bigger one. And we're ready to start working on our application. Excellent. Once we have our brand new React app, first thing we're going to do some spring cleaning because it comes with some of the boilerplate that we're not going to need. Okay, let's start with index CSS. Let's just select everything and delete it. Now, alternatively, we could, of course, just head over to index.js and remove the import. It's really up to you. Then we're going to head over to app.js. And then I don't think we're going to need a logo, as well as far as our return is concerned. Let's just set it up as a simple dummy text. And I'm going to go with hello from app, something like that. Let's save it. Now I'm still going to keep my app CSS, but within the app CSS, again, we have a few options. Either we can drag and drop the app CSS that we have in the setup files or the setup folder, or I can just select everything within my app CSS and then in fact replace it with the content that I have in the setup files. So it is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to delete the app CSS. Then let's open up the setup files and right away select everything that I have in there. And let's just copy and paste it. Okay, let's save it. That should be our look where we have our gray background as well as we have our fonts. Okay, now at this point, we can already close it. We're not going to need it. And then let's also set up our components. So essentially all the components that we're going to use all throughout our project. And in order to do that, I'm going to head over to a source folder. Within the source folder, I'm going to create one more folder by the name of components. And then within this folder, I'm going to create my components. Now, it's really up to you however you call those components. You can just go with generic names like form, item, and list. But I'm going to add, in fact, in front of it, the expense. So I'm going to say expense form JS. Then I'm also going to create the expense item JS, expense item JS. In fact, this particular component is going to be responsible for each and every item that we're adding or removing or editing in our list. As well as there's going to be two more, the name of alert.js. And last but not least, we're going to add a expense list.js. So that is the component that is responsible for our list. All right. Now, once we create these components, I'm going to zoom out and you know what? Let's close some tabs. I don't think I'm going to need the app CSS or index CSS as well as the app.js for the time being. Well, maybe let's not close it, but let's just navigate to a different component. And as far as components, since this particular project is in fact big on React hooks, well, all of them are going to be a React functional components. And in order to create them as functional components, I'm going to use my extension by the name of this one, the ES7 React Redux, yada, 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 native snippets. And there's multiple snippets that we can use. Like I said, we're not going to create a class-based component, but if you would like to, you just type RCC. By the way, I can right away see it in my suggestions. But in our case, we can either go with RFC, which is a functional component. However, in this case, the syntax would be the function and then whatever return we are doing, or we can right away create it as a arrow function. So the syntax for that, or the snippet for that, would be RAFC. And then we're creating a functional component. Now, let me again change my layout here just so I can see my project files instead of the extensions. And then as far as the actual components go for now, let's just type some dummy text where we say hello from expense form, just so we can see that we are in fact rendered them correctly. That is our expense form. Then also let's do the same thing for expense item. Hello from expense item. Then we also have the same spiel for the alert. Hello from alert. And last but not least, we do have our expense list. So let's write again, functional component. Hello from expense list. Now, 3 of these components we're going to render within the app.js. However, the item, in fact, is going to be within the expense list. So there's no point for us to render it within the app.js, since we know that at the end of the day, the way our setup is going to work is we're going to have a list, and then for each and every item in the list, we're going to render the expense item. So let's right away head over to expense list. Let's import our body, the expense item. But you know what? You can just call this item. It doesn't really matter. As long as I'm in fact looking for the correct component by the name of expense item, since my export is default, I can really call this however I would like. All right. And then let's say right after this div, why don't we render the expense item by the name of item right now? Let's save that. And last but not least, we're going to head over to app.js, and I'm going to import my 3 components by the name of alert, by the name of expense form, and expense list. Okay. Let's write it, import. Let's call this expense list from, again, we're heading over to a components folder. Within the components folder, we have our list component. That's number 1. Let's in fact copy and paste that. And let's just change these values. Where for the second one, I'm going to change it to a form. Let's delete that. It is going to be my form. And then last but not least, of course, I'm going to look for my alert. So again, I'm going to select 2 cursors and let's just write alert. Okay. Let's save that in fact. And now let's decide how we're going to render them. Essentially, what would be the order? Now, in my return, I'm going to delete this dummy text, as well as instead of using the div, I'm going to use the React fragment, where we could import fragment from the React and just place it here. But I'm going to use the shortcut where I have the angle brackets. Okay. And then one by one, first of all, let's render our alert. Then let's also render our form. So expense form. And last but not least, we do have our expense list. That is going to be our last component. And the moment we do that in the browser, we can see that we have our alert component as well as the form and list. And then within list, we are rendering the expense item. So successfully, we're done with our setup and we can move on to our next task. Once we're done with our folder structure, next one up, I would like to render my list. So we're not going to worry about, in fact, setting up the form and adding the item or deleting the item or modifying the item, first, let's just take a look at how our list looks like. Okay. Now, before we can even render our list, we're going to have some kind of dummy data. So that's the reason why I'm going to head over to app.js, and we're going to create a variable by the name of initial expenses. So let's write const initial expenses like so. And this particular variable is going to be an array. And then each and every item in this array is going to be an I object. All right. Now for the ID, let's just come up with, let's say, number 1. Then we're going to have a property by the name of charge, and I'm going to set it equal to a rent. Now, last but not least, the last property in the particular item is going to be an amount. So how much this particular expense is costing. Okay. Now let's in fact copy and paste it. And for the time being, in fact, we're going to change the values to 1, 2, and 3. But in a second, we're going to go over of the package that we just installed by the name of UUID and how we can use it, in fact, to make it a dynamic value. Okay. Then also let's change these values for the second one. The charge value is not going to be a string of rent. We're going to set it as car payment. Now let's say car payment is, I don't know, 400. And last but not least, we have our credit card bill, and that is going to be, I don't know, 1200. Something like that. And we can right away set up the console log, just so we know that everything works correctly. So let's write our console log, and let's try to console log initial expenses, like so. And then if we head over to our developer tools, in a console, we should have the array with 3 items. Now, the problem is later on when we're going to be working with our form, when we're going to be adding our items dynamically, well, this kind of setup for the IDs, well, it's not feasible. All right, so we could set up some kind of logic here where each and every time I'm adding the item, we could calculate the ID ourselves, or let's say add to some kind of initial, let's say, number of 0. But we can also use, in fact, the package that we just installed by the name of UUID. And the syntax works like so, where we import UUID from, and then we have the package name UUID, and then we need to have a /, and I'm going to go with version number 4. And instead of setting this up as a 1, 2, or 3, well, in fact, the syntax is UUID, and then we just invoke it. Okay. So for all of them, we're going to do exactly the same. Invoke for the second one, invoke for the third one as well. Let's save it. And again, if my dev tools, we're going to see that right now we have dynamic, in fact, IDs where each of them have a long, unique ID. Okay. Now, if you're a little bit more interested in the actual package, just Google the UUID npm. Again, you're going to see the actual documentation where I'm using the version number 4. And like I said, the only thing we need to do is, in fact, import the UUID. And if we want our ID, we just need to invoke it. Even though we could render our list as it is, meaning from our array, since eventually we would like to modify our list as well, we're going to have a state in our app component. Now, prior to React hooks, first our component would have to be a class-based component. Then we would set up our state and access it using this .setState. But since React hooks allow us to implement state in functional components, here's what we're going to do. So first of all, we're going to have to import useState from React. Now, useState is a function that returns array with 2 values. So the first value is the actual value of the state, and the second one is a function that controls this state. Okay. And lastly, we would need to pass the default state in the use state. Okay. Now, let's first get rid of these comments, since those are just memories about class-based components. Step number 1. Then let's head over to React and let's get our use state hook. And then, like I said, use state hook is a function that returns array with 2 values. And in order to see that in action, the fastest way is in fact using the console log. Then let's use state and let's run it. And you know what? In order to see it a bit clearer, I'm going to delete console log from our previous video. And you'll notice in the console that I have the array with 2 values. Like I said, currently the first value is undefined. That would be the value of my state. And the second one is the function that controls it. Okay. Now there's multiple ways how we can in fact access both of these values. I could do something like this, where I have the result and I'm going to set it equal to use state. And in this case, I'm going to right away use my initial value. Now, please keep in mind that initial value could be anything. It could be a string, it could be an empty object, could be an empty array, you name it. But in our case, since I would like to render my list, well, that's the reason why I'm going to set it equal to initial expenses, like so. And I can, in fact, remove my previous console log. And then since I know that I'm getting back the array, I could do const expenses is equal to result. And of course, since I would like to keep, in fact, the value of my state in the expenses variable, well, that's the reason why I set it equal to a result, which is my array. And since arrays are 0 index based, well, we could access it this way. And I could copy and paste it and, in fact, set it equal to set expenses. So the name of my function, set expenses to a result number 1, since that is the second item. And if, again, we would like to console log it, let's write expenses and set expenses, like so. Let's save it, and you'll notice that my first value, in fact, will be my array, and the second one is going to be my function. Okay? Now, there's obviously a faster way of how we can do that. Now, the way we do it is, in fact, by using the array destructuring, where the syntax is following. Instead of just having some kind of result variable, in fact, we set up our square brackets, and then I'm setting up my variable expenses. And in fact, this variable right now holds this same value. So the value of my state. And the second one is set expenses, which again is my function. Now, please keep in mind that both of them are variables. And since both of them are variables, well, we can name them however we would like. I went with expenses and set expenses just because convention usually is whatever you have for your state value, while the function is set and then whatever you had for your value. But again, you're not limited. You can call this orange and banana. It doesn't really matter as long as you have these values. And for the last time in a video, let's just log out our current state. So we have our expenses. And if we're going to log it out, I can see that we have the array with 3 items. So successfully, we set up our state as well as the function that controls the state. And this way, we don't have to set up our component as a class-based component and use this.state. Instead, we just import the use state hook. The use state hook is a function that is looking for initial value, and then the function returns the array with 2 items. And we're using the array destructuring where we set up 2 variables. One holds the value of the 0 index or the first item in the array, and the second one holds, in fact, the second item in the array, which is a function. Now, enough with console logging. Why don't we render our list? First and foremost, I'm going to close, in fact, the dev tools. I'm not going to need them right now, as well as let's not console log anymore or anything. Then let's select all my comments and also delete them as well. And first, I guess, let's work on the return within the app.js component. First and foremost, like I said, I'm going to keep here my React fragment. And that's number 1. But right after the alert, I'm going to set up a heading 1. And for this particular heading 1, I'd like to have a text of budget calculator, like so. Let's save it. And we should have this massive heading 1 with this particular styling. Okay, of course, our styling comes from the app CSS. Then, right after the heading 1, I'm going to create a main element. Now, the main element is going to have a class name of app, like so. And then let's place both of these components, expense form and expense list, within our main element. And since our logic is that we have our expense item sitting within the expense list, I'm going to pass my array, my initial state, into expense list, in fact, as a prop of expenses. And I'm going to set it equal to expenses. That, of course, is coming from use state. And lastly, I would like to set up my total, where I would like to calculate, well, how much are we spending? Okay. And the logic is going to be somewhat simple, where we do have our array. So why don't we set up one more heading 1, and let's just use the reduce method to calculate that. So let's go with heading 1. Then for this particular heading 1, why don't we add text of total spending? Then let's add a colon. And then right after that, why don't we set up a span? For the span, let's add a class name of, let's say, total, just so we have a bit of styling. And then I'm going to use a $, as well as set up my expression. And we know that if we would like to access the expression within the JSX, the syntax is the curly braces. And then, like I said, our expenses is in fact array. So let's write expenses. And by the way, as always, it is not the only way how we could calculate that, but I just think that reduce method is probably the most straightforward one. But of course, we could use the map, and it doesn't really matter. Now, as far as reduced is concerned, well, we have to pass in the callback function, correct? So the callback function is going to be applied for each and every item we have in our array, as well as specifically for reduce. In fact, we do have to set up our initial value. So since I know that I'm going to be calculating some kind of values, well, I'm just going to set it up as number 0. So that is going to be my initial value. And then within the callback function, we have 2 parameters. One is going to be accumulator and the other one current. But since these are parameters, of course, you can name them however you would like. So the first one, the accumulator, is in fact reflecting our total. So that is going to be our total. And the second one is the current. So current item in our iteration. And last thing, we're going to need to return our accumulator. However, not only we're going to return the accumulator, in fact, for each and every iteration, I'm going to add whatever value I have within my amount. So let's write return. Accumulator is in fact adding the current. And then since the property name is the amount, that's the reason why we in fact set it as current dot amount. And the moment we do that, we see here on the right hand side that I have my total. Now I have zoomed in massively and not in my text editor, but in fact in my browser. And then of course, once I zoom out, you notice that it looks a little bit better. But of course, if you don't want, in fact, maybe to have the space, you can also do it this way. It's really up to you. And we're done, at least initially, with our return in our app.js component. Since we're passing down our expenses as a expenses prop into our expense list component, well, next we can work on expense list return, since eventually we would like to render each and every item in our expenses list. Okay. First things first, in order to access the props, we have multiple ways. I could write here, let's say props, and then do my destructuring somewhere above the return, or we can write away the structure out our expenses. So let's write expenses. Then we're also going to change around a little bit our current return, where instead of div, I'm going to use the fragment. That's number 1. And then also let's delete both of these suckers for the time being. And then, in fact, let's set up a unordered list. Now, for the unordered list, we're going to add, in fact, a class name with the value of list. Okay, again, just for the styling. And then we're going to set up also our expression where we have the expenses array. And I would like to use a map method to iterate over this particular array. Now within the map method, we're passing in a callback function, and this callback function is applied for each and every item in the array. And if we'd like to access, in fact, each and every item, well, we just need to come up with parameter name, which in my case is going to be expense. And the logic is following, where I'm iterating over my array, which currently is holding my initial expenses. And then each and every expense, I'm going to wrap in the expense item and pass the values for, let's say, the charge and the amount into my expense item. Okay. Now, the way it is going to work, let's set up first of all the return, and then let's write the name of our component, whether that was expense item or item in my case. Then, since I'm rendering the list, I do need to make sure that I'm adding, in fact, the key prop with some kind of unique value. Now, our unique value is, in fact, sitting within the expense ID, because each and every expense has this unique ID, as well as I would like to pass in the data. So basically, the rest of the data that I have, whether that's charge and amount, as well as ID into my item. So I'm going to set up one more prop by the name of expense, and then whatever values I have within the item, well, we're just going to pass it down. Okay. And let's close out our item for the time being. Let's save it. I do have 3 items. However, the reason why I have 3 items, well, because we haven't set up any kind of functionality where, again, we are destructuring more information about each and every component. For the time being, well, we just have this one dummy text, hello from expense item. However, one last thing that I would like to add within the expense list is, in fact, the clear button. So right after the unordered list, I could set up right away the button. However, the logic is going to be following, where this button, clear expenses, is only going to show when we have any items in a list. So essentially, when the list is clear, like so, well, then we don't have the button either. So I could right away set up the button, but instead I'm going to set up the expression where I'm going to look for, in fact, the value, whether expenses array, whether the length of this particular array is bigger than 0. And only then I'm going to actually render my button. So in this case, if the value is true, if the expenses length is bigger than 0, well, anything that we're going to write after the and, well, then it is going to be rendered. Okay. And in this case, we're going to go for button. And you know what? Let's right away set it as proper HTML element. For the button, eventually there is going to be a on-click method. But for the time being, I'm just going to go with BTN, or I'm sorry, event handler, I guess. And then, like I said, yes, eventually there's going to be a on-click event handler. But for the time being, let's just leave this blank, as well as within the particular button, let's write clear expenses. And lastly, I would like to, in fact, add one more thing, and that is going to be my icon. Now, in order to work with icons, let me just show you that if we head over to google.com, then we type react icons, I believe it was netlify.com. Then once we head over there, you'll notice the documentation. Well, first and foremost, we had to install it, which we did. So that is fine. And then, of course, we can pick whatever library we would want. So if we would like to get an icon, we just need to have the icon name, which in the example they're showing for the beer. And then we have from React icons / and then whatever library we're using. So I'm going to use the material design icons. So I'm going to have React icons / MD. And then if you would like to pick whatever icons you would like, well, just head over there and pick whatever name. Now, once we have that set up, well, we're going to have a component, and then we can even add a class on this particular component. So let's go ahead and let's do that. Where let's import. The name of my particular icon is capital case M, then D, and then delete. Okay. And like I said, it's coming from React icons / MD. And then right after clear expenses, we're going to do two things. First of all, I would like to render my component, my icon component. So MD, delete, and let's also add a class name. Now for the class name, I'm going to add btn icon. Okay, we can close out our icon. Let's save it. And I do have successfully added my icon, as well as we have our expression where first and foremost, we're checking the length. So if we're not going to have any items in our list, well, the button is not gonna be displayed. Now, once we have passed down the info from our initial list into the item, well, it just makes sense if we would head over back to expense item. And first and foremost, we're going to, in fact, destructure out the expense. That, of course, is the name of the prop. And then, you know what? We're going to do a little bit more destructuring. And as a side note, I could have done it here as well. I could have set a colon and then just look for whatever items I would like, whether that's ID, whether that's charge, or whether that's amount. We definitely can do that as well. But since I'm going to pass later on the handle delete and handle edit, in fact, functions, well, I'm just going to skip it and leave a little bit more room in my parameters. Okay. Now let's write const again, and let's do a little bit of destructuring where I'm going to look for the ID. I'm going to look for charge as well as the amount from my expense prop. Okay. Then what is happening with my return? First and foremost, div goes by. Then also this dummy text is not going to be rendered. And then also I'm going to set up a div here. So first let's start with our div. And this particular div is going to have a class name of info, class name info. And then within this div, first of all, I would like to render the charge as well as the amount. And the way our setup is going to work, we're going to have a span class name of expense. And then, of course, let's also access right away our charge. So that's our charge. And of course, that is the value that's coming from our expense prop. And initially, it is coming from our charge property. So whatever we have here as a text, that's number one. By the way, if I save it, you'll notice it right away. As you can see, we have rent, car payment, and credit card bill. Okay, then after that, I'm going to add, in fact, another span. And you know what? There's one thing missing with our list item. Let's also add a class name of item, just so we can have a little bit more styling. There you go. And then, like I said, still span, still class name. Now, in this case, the class name is going to be amount. Then let's close out our span. And let's, in fact, access the value for our amount. So let's write amount. And why don't we also add, in fact, the $sign? Like so. No, that's not what I wanted. I wanted a $sign. And then right after the info, in fact, we're going to set up two buttons. But since both buttons are gonna use two icons, well, why don't we import them first? Let's write import. Then we're looking for MD edit as well as MD delete. Okay, from React icons MD library. Okay, then we have the div. Okay, div has a class name of info, but we're also gonna use div for our buttons. So div, let's set up a first button. Now for the first button, let's add a class name of edit btn. And in fact, we're also going to set up a aria label. Aria label. And the reason is very simple because, in fact, we're not going to have any kind of text in there. So aria label is going to be edit button. And then let's place within our button our icon for editing. Like so. That's my button number one. And you know what? Just to speed it up a little bit, again, let's copy and paste it. And let's change the values. So the class name for the second button is going to be clear button. Okay, that's step number one. Aria label is going to be delete, but and then last but not least, of course, our icon is also going to be different. And in my case, I'm gonna go with MD delete. And there you go. We have our list, so our initial list. So now we can start working on our functionality. More specifically, we're gonna start setting up our form where we can add more values into our expenses array. Since there's going to be quite a bit of functionality within our form, in fact, first I would just like to have a visual display where we're going to set up our inputs as well as the button without any kind of functionality. Okay. Now, I also would like to let you know that at this point in time, since again, we're not passing down our functions for deleting or editing the item, well, we can just close out the item as well as the list. And then, you know what? Also alert. Well, we're going to cover it later on anyway. Okay. Now, as far as the form is concerned, as you can see, we're not passing down any kind of props. So we don't need to worry about it right now. But believe me, we will in a second. But we are going to use one button or I'm sorry, icon, I guess, that is going to be in our button. So let's import one more icon. In this case, MD send from. Again, let's look for our icons library. And once we have our import, let's save it. And let's write a different return. First and foremost, we're going to return a form. That's number one. Also, this silly dummy text is not going to be there. Then also, why don't we set up a div? So again, eventually, there's going to be a onSubmit event handler. But currently, again, we're not going to worry about that. And then let's write div. For this particular div, we'll add a class name of form center. Then we're going to add another div with a class name of form group. So class name form group. And yes, I did stole these class names from Bootstrap, just in case you're wondering. And then right after the form group or within the form group, you can say, I'm going to set up a label. Now, since I'm going to have the ID of expense, I'm going to write expense. And then within the label, well, why don't we write a charge? Okay. Then let's set up our input. It is going to be a text input. However, let's add also right away a class name of form control. Okay. Then also we're going to add a charge ID. Or you know what? If I'm adding charge ID, then I might as well change it here, correct? So ID is going to be a charge. And then name also is going to be a charge. Now, as far as name is concerned, it is very, very important. Because in fact, we're going to access it when we're setting up our functionality within the app.js. So make sure that you are in fact using the correct values for whatever you're setting up here for the name. Okay. Then that's step number one. What else? Well, I guess we can add a placeholder. And let's just say example rent. And we still are going to add value as well as on change. But like I said, since I would like to set up first the visual display and only then the functionality, that's why we're going to leave them blank for now. Let's save it. We do have our charge. Awesome. So I can add some kind of dummy text. Let's say rent. And of course, currently nothing happens. But I'm also going to add one more div. So let me select this particular div. Let's copy and paste it. And let's just change some values around where the label is not going to have the charge and instead amount. And also amount here as a text. Then I'm also going to change both of these, the ID as well as the name. So let's delete it and let's set it equal to amount as well as last. Well, the example is not going to be rent. In fact, we're going to set it as 100 something. Okay. And then right after the center div, and that's important, please don't place it within the center div, but right after the center div, we're going to set up a submit button. So let's write button. Then the type is going to be a submit. And then class name is going to be a btn. And I'm going to set up some text within this particular button. Well, let's just write submit, as well as let's add a icon. So it's md send. That's our name icon. Class name btn icon, like so. And we have our visual setup for our form component. Basically, we're done with our UI without any kind of functionality. So I could add rent, let's say, and let's set it as 100. Now, of course, once I click on submit, nothing happens because we haven't added any kind of functionality yet. Excellent. We have our inputs, but in order to get values from our inputs, we're going to have to set them up as controlled inputs, where we have the value in the state that references the input, as well as the onChange handler. Now, since we are using React hooks in order to set up the state values, we're going to use state again. Now, as a side note, I purposely placed all my functionality in app.js, but you don't have to. Since it is React, there's more than one way of doing it. And I chose this one just because I find it more useful for general understanding. Now, let's get those state values. First and foremost, why don't we add a bit of comments just so we can separate it? Because first and foremost, on the top here, we're going to have our state values. And then down in the bottom here, we're going to have our functionality. So I'm going to start by adding the comment. And I'm going to add some stars. And I'm going to say state values, like so. And once I have this particular comment, I'm going to copy and paste the line. And then in here, I'm going to write functionality. And hopefully I'm going to spell it correctly, functionality. And then let's add some more single comments where I'm going to say that this is for all my expenses. So all expenses, and then comma, add expense. Okay. And then we're going to set up two more state values using use state. One for the input for the charge, and the second one for the input of the amount. Okay. Now, the way we write that is, in fact, again, adding one more comment. Let's just say it's going to be single expense, like so. Then again, we're going to do some destructuring from the function. And in this case, I'm going to call this charge and then set charge. That is going to be the name of my function. So set charge, and that is equal to a use state. And remember, within the use state, we are passing in the default value. So in this case, my default value is going to be an empty string. Okay. Then, since I have the single expense, I'm also going to copy and paste, in fact, this one more time, like so. And we're just going to change some values here, where instead of single expense, it is going to be a single amount. So that was, in fact, our string here, but now we're dealing with the amount. Okay. And then also let's change the naming for our values. So of course, since this is in fact the state value for the amount, I'm going to name this amount. And instead of set charge, well, we're going to deal with set amount. Okay. Now the initial value is going to be exactly the same. So in both cases, we're just going to pass a empty string. Okay. Those would be our state values for the time being. And as you can see, we added two more, one for the charge and the second one for the amount. Okay. Now, as our functionality goes, well, we're going to have to set up two more functions. And in fact, three more functions. Sorry. We need one for handling the onChange for our charge, then another one for handling the onChange for our amount, and third one when we are submitting the form. Now, for all of them, we're going to pass the event object. So how it's going to look like? Well, we're going to write const handle charge, and you can obviously name it however you'd like. And then, like I said, within the function, we're passing in the event object. And then since we have right now our use state, well, I could just simply use the set charge. Remember, that was the function that controls the value. So the way it's going to work, I'm going to call my function set charge. And within this particular function, Well, I'm going to pass in the event object. Then it has the target property. And lastly, it has the value. Now, the value is going to be whatever we're going to type within this particular input. All right. And what we're doing is when we're going to call this particular method, and by the way, we're going to call this method each and every time the user is going to type something within that input. Well, we're going to change right away the state value as well. Because notice initially it is a string, but then each and every time the user is going to type something, well, we're going to call this particular function by grabbing the value from the input. All right. Now the same is going to work for the amount. Let's copy and paste that. Instead of handle charge, why don't we write this as a amount like so? And lastly, like I said, we also are going to need a submit function, basically a function that we called when we submit it. So let's call this handle submit like so. And for the time being, the only functionality that is going to be in there is in fact the prevent default, just to prevent some default behavior from the form. So let's write prevent default like so. We need to call it. And then once we have all these functions, I'm going to have to pass them within my expense form, correct? Because we have the state value, we also have the functions, so we're going to have to pass them within the expense form. Now, one thing might help you if you're kind of foggy on this, if you're thinking, well, what's happening in here? You can also do always a console log where we're just checking what kind of values we're getting back. So in this case, I'm going to write, you know what? I'm going to write with the backticks. So I'm going to say charge, and then let's look at the value that we're going to have in the console. So let's write the same event target value like so. And let's just copy and paste it. And also let's set it for the handle amount. We're going to copy and paste that. And in this case, we're going to look for a different one. So I'm going to say, you know what? This one is going to be an amount. And the previous one is going to be charge. Okay. Now, like I said, once we have the state values as well as the methods that we are calling when we are running the on change handler, well, we need to pass them down. And I'm going to head over to a expense form component. And then we're just going to pass it down as props. So first, let's start with, I don't know, maybe charge. So let's write charge is equal to my charge value that's coming from the state. Then I also have the amount, and it's going to be equal to my amount prop. Then we have a handle charge as well as handle amount. So let's write handle amount prop is equal to our handle amount function. Then handle charge prop is equal to a handle charge method, like so. And lastly, we have handle submit. So let's write handle submit prop is equal to a handle submit method. Okay. Now, once we have this particular setup, and you know what? I think I skipped here where, in fact, handle charge needs to be the name of my prop. Okay. Because that exactly matches my function. Now let's save it. As you can see, we're passing in those props. And now let's head over back to expense form. And then within the expense form, I would like to destructure these values out. Okay. That's going to be our next topic where we're going to grab all these values. So let's start with charge, then amount. Then we have handle charge method. Then also handle charge or handle amount function, handle amount function. And lastly, we had handle submit. Handle submit. And now we just need to, in fact, bravely add them to our correct inputs, where we have our first input that is going to deal with our charge. And this is the case where, first and foremost, we're going to set up a value prop. So let's write value or value attribute. And then for the value, we're going to pass the charge that we're getting from the state. Again, this is the state value that's coming from the app. Okay. And also, like I said, we also need on change handler, where we're going to set it equal to our function. And the function name was handle charge. Okay. That is as far as the charge is concerned. Then for the amount, first and foremost, you know what? I'm going to change this. We're going to go with a number in this case. Okay. So instead of text, I'm going to set it as a number, and I'm going to do both of the same things that I did before, where I'm going to have a value attribute and it's going to be equal to my amount in this time. Okay. Because now I'm getting the value from the state by the name of amount that's coming from the app.js. I also need to have my own change handler. So let's write on change, and that is going to be equal to handle amount, like so. And last but not least, remember we have the form. And of course, we also for the form have the on submit handler. And then let's write on submit. I'm going to call, in fact, handle submit. Handle submit. Let's, in fact, save this for the time being. And you know what? We are going to open up the console just so we can see what happens as we start typing in. Okay. Now, of course, there's going to be some warnings because we haven't used some of the variables, but that's okay. So as I start typing the rent, notice, let's say rent, and in the console, what I'm having here is the charge as well as the value. So now if I head over back to app.js, instead of the state value being just an empty string, which was my initial value, in fact, it is equal to whatever I typed. In my case, that was rent. So the same thing is going to work with amount, where if I'm going to start typing whatever kind of value, you'll notice that, in fact, I'm getting back my value. Now, you're probably noticing one bug, though, where I copied and pasted and I didn't change the function name. Because remember, within the handle charge function, in fact, we called our set charge that was coming from the use state. And this particular function was responsible for changing the value in my state by the name of charge. Or in this case, since we're dealing with handle amount, well, we also need to call a different function. So let me rewrite this and let's say set amount. And then in this case, it should work. Where again, I'm going to start with some kind of car payment. That is, of course, my charge, as you can see. And then if we're going to write some kind of value, notice, of course, I'm having my correct value by the 200. Okay. So again, just to go over, we did set up two state values, one by the name of charge and the amount. And of course, you can name them however you'd like. But the most important thing, it comes with a function that in fact controls this particular value. So whenever we type in the set charge, well, we can just come up with whatever is going to be the value name. So since in my case, I just passed in the value property from my object, well, that's how I'm changing it. But I could have easily just, I don't know, wrote some kind of number or something like that, or some type of string. The most important thing is when you run the function that comes with that particular state value, well, essentially, you are just changing that value by passing in the new value within that set charge or set amount function. So then we also had a handle submit that was preventing the default. And lastly, of course, we passed it into expense form. And then once we destructure it out in the expense form component, well, we just added two correct places where handle submit is going to be called when we have on submit handler, as well as for each and every value, we had the value prop or value attribute that was set equal to a state. So we're creating a controlled input. And on change handler is set to our specific handle method. Once we have our state values as well as the handle functions, why don't we switch gears and start dealing with the on submit handle? Because at the moment, well, we are grabbing our values and in fact, we're setting them up in a state, but I can click all day long the submit button and nothing is happening. All right. Now within the app.js, like I said, we had our handle submit, and first and foremost, we prevented the default. All right. Next one up. Well, why don't we in fact get rid of these console logs? Because I would like to show you that for each and every submit, first and foremost, we are going to access the values in a state anyway. So in this case, why don't we again console log it? Because that should give us a good idea where I would like to grab both of these state values, one by the name of charge and the second one by the name of the amount. All right, let's save it. And again, I'm going to start typing. Let's say rent, and rent is 200. Now, the moment we're going to click a submit button, of course, I have my values. So I have a rent and I have 200. And if your wheels are spinning, because you already can see how we can add that, that is really, really well. Because think about it. We have our initial expenses, correct? So I do have it as my array, and I also have my set expenses function. And we already have used it twice for set charge and set amount. So we know that in order to add this particular expense that we have right now in our state, well, we just need to call the set expenses method, correct? Now, however, there's few things that I would like to do first. Well, I would like to check whether the values are not empty. Now, I'm not going to do any kind of really sophisticated checking. I'm just going to say like this, where I'm going to have a if and else statement, and I'm going to write if charge, so the values in my state is not equal to an empty string. So I'm going to set it not equal to an empty string, and amount is bigger than 0, because there's no point for me to add some kind of expense with amount that is in fact negative. So I'm going to write amount is bigger than 0. So if that is the case, then in fact, we're going to set up the functionality where we add to our expenses. However, if the case is where we have, let's say, an empty value for one of them, well, later on, we're going to call a handle alert. Now, we don't have that function yet. So for the time being, I'm just going to leave the comments here. So let's write handle alert called. All right. Now, however, let's also set up the functionality where everything works, where the charge is some kind of text as well as amount is bigger than 0. So how are we going to do that? Well, first of all, I'm going to create a new object, because notice all the items in my array were in fact objects. And I already have both of these state values by the time I'm submitting, correct? Because I do have the charge, that would be my text, as well as I have my amount. That is, of course, my number. So in this case, what I'm going to do is in fact set up a const, and I'm going to call this single expense. Again, as always, you can call this however you would like. Expense is equal to an object. Remember, we needed to have the ID as well. And we already used our package UUID. So I'm going to do exactly the same. So I'm going to say ID is in fact equal to UUID. Then I'm going to call it, as well as I have both of the properties, one for charge and the second one for the amount. So I could write like this. I could say charge and then access my value from the state by the name of charge. But since in the ES6, we can just write like this, where if the property name is equal to whatever we're accessing, I can just skip it and I can say, you know what, there's going to be a charge property by the value of whatever is coming from the state. Okay, in this case, charge. And the same thing I can do with amount. Just please remember, again, it is exactly the same if I would have wrote it like this. Okay, amount is equal to amount. But since we would like to skip some real estate, I can just say, all right, so I have my single expense. Now, here comes the more interesting part, where we have our set expenses, correct? And it is a function, and now we need to pass in the value. Now, the problem is right now, if we have been working a lot with this dot set state, we remember that, in fact, well, we could just pass in the value, correct? So we had this dot set state, and we just set a new value. Now, the problem with this particular functionality is that when we're using the function that controls that state value, I need to also access the old values. Otherwise, I'm just going to override that. Now, just to show you, let's say I'm going to set this equal to an array, and I do need to set this to array because remember, this is an object. So if I'm just going to pass the object, well, my functionality is going to break. But you know what? Yeah, you know what? Why don't we try it out? Let's write single expense. So we're going to go again with the rent just because it's the fastest name, 200, and we're submitted. And of course, I have a bunch of errors because remember, we are relying on the fact that our value in our expenses is in fact array. Okay, so that's the reason why I said we're going to have to set it at least as an empty array, meaning an array with this particular value. Now, the issue right now is that, again, if we're going to submit this particular value with, let's say, 200, you'll notice that the rest of them are deleted. Because what I'm saying here is, all right, I'm going to call set expense, and I'm just going to overwrite everything that I had before. Now, in order to avoid that, we need to use the spread operator. Well, first and foremost, I would like to access everything that I had already in the expenses. And we can use the spread operator. So I'm still passing in the array. However, I'm grabbing all the values that I had already previously, which in my case were the initial expenses. And then I'm just adding this new object, the single expense that we just added. Okay. So let's save this one. And then let's see what we're going to have. And in this case, I'm going to write, okay, again, let's go with rent. And let's say we're going to have some 200 and let's submit it. Now, in this case, what do you see here? Well, I do see the rent, but there's a couple of issues. Well, first of all, we need to clean out these values. We need to make sure that they are empty strings. And second, you'll notice that in our functionality, we also have an issue. And the problem is very simple, where we are checking the values right now. However, when we're grabbing the values from the inputs, we right away, even though it is a number here, even though it is a type number, where we're getting them as strings. So first of all, as far as our functionality for the total, what we would need to do is in fact write parse int. So pass our value from the amount into parse integer. Okay. Then once we save it, let's check it out. Again, we have the rent. Then rent is 200. Let's submit it. And of course, now it works correctly because now we're finally dealing it as a number instead of a string. Okay. That's number one. And second, like I said, we would need to clean out the values because currently I still have my old value. So I can just keep on adding pretty much rent all the time. And I wouldn't want to do that. So in order to set that up, well, let's just call the set charge and set amount. Because remember, again, those were the functions that control these state values. So the way we do that is say set charge, and let's again set charge to an empty string. Let's copy and paste it. And also let's write set amount is empty string. Okay. Now in this case, you know what? I think I can close the console. I think we saw everything that we needed. And again, let's write rent. And in this case, let's be more realistic. 2,500. Let's add it. And now I have both of the things. My total is working. So as you can see, my total spending is correct. It is not adding values. It's in fact correctly displaying whatever value I had. And then also both of my inputs are empty because I used both of these functions to go back to whatever value I would like. Next, I would like to set up the alert functionality, where if we try to submit with, let's say, empty values, we're going to get a alert. And the same is going to work when we submit successfully, as well as if we, let's say, clean out the list. All right. Now, since it does require multiple steps, the way it's going to work, well, first of all, I'm going to set everything up and I'm going to try to talk as much through as we're doing it. And then at the very end, I'm going to head over back and we're going to go step by step again. All right. Now, first of all, we need to set up our value in the state. And we should be already experts where we can use state. So let's destructure two things. First of all, I'm going to call this alert as well as set alert like so. That is the name of my function and set it equal to use state. Now, in this case, I'm not going to pass the array. I'm not going to pass the empty string. In fact, we're going to have the object. And then within the object, there's going to be a property and the initial value is going to be false. Okay, so we have a show property with a value of false. That's number one. Then we'll head over back into our return. So let's head down. Where is our return? And then notice, initially, we're just looking for the alert. And that's the reason why we have the text. Now, in this case, I would like to set up the expression. And the expression is going to be following, where I'm going to check my value in the state. Remember, I had an object by the name of alert. And then within that particular object, I had a property of show. Okay. And initially it was set to false. And in this case, I'm going to check, well, what is the value for the show? So since it is false, well, I'm not going to display, in fact, the alert. So that's the reason why I'm writing alert, check the property of show, what is the value, and only if that value is true, then we're going to display the alert component. Now, also, I'm going to set up two things. One is going to be a prop by the name of type. And in here, I'm going to pass in the property of type. And of course, at the moment, we don't have this property. All right. So this property is going to be only within that particular object if the actual property of show is true. Okay. That's number one. And then also, we're going to have a text property, and the value is going to be alert and text. Okay. Another property that is not currently there, but it's going to be there once we set up of alert of true. Okay. That's number one. Then what else we have? Well, we would like to work, in fact, on our actual alert. So let's open up the alert like so. And then within the alert, I would like to access both of these things. First and foremost, I would like to get the type prop, type, as well as text. And then we're going to switch around a little bit where we are going to return the div. That's correct. But for the class name, we're going to set it up dynamic, where I'm going to set up the curly braces, and then we're also going to use the backticks because I would like to access that particular type. And I'm going to say that alert is going to have right away by default the alert class, as well as depending on whether the alert is going to be success or the danger, meaning something went wrong, then we're also going to have another class that controls those values. And the class name is going to be alert. And this is the case when we're going to access our prop. Okay. So I'm going to say, give me the prop that is being passed in. And then last but not least, well, why don't we just show the text that we're going to pass within our alert? So in order to access it, again, we have the curly braces, and now let's save it. Okay. Now we have our setup, and currently, of course, our alert is not being displayed for a very simple reason that alert is in fact what? Well, it is set equal to the false. Okay. And also I would like to point your attention that we're going to use two types. And if we head over back to app CSS, you'll notice that we have the alert. Like I said, that is my initial class that deals with, in fact, with my alert. That's the reason why I added this class first. And then we have alert danger. Like I said, my type of danger, and type of success, where in fact we're just changing the background values. Where if the alert is danger, then the background is red. And if the alert is success, well, the background is main green. All right. That was my functionality. And then within the app CSS, we have our state value. Awesome. But then why don't we head over, let's say, I don't know, above the handle submit and create another function. And this particular function name is going to be handle alert. And in this function, we're going to set up functionality to handle our alert. So let's say handle alert. And you know what? While we're at it, I think we can add more comments just so we know what's happening. So let's write handle charge. Then let's write handle amount function, as well as handle submit. Okay. Just so we have a clear understanding. So submit. All right. Now within the handle alert, what are we going to write? Well, we're going to set up a function. So let's call this handle alert. That's first. And then this particular function is going to expect a object passed into it. So the object is going to have two things. First, the property of type, and the second, the property of text. Okay, that's number one. It's going to be an arrow function. And within this particular function, what we're going to do is we are going to call the set alert. Because again, remember, that was the function that controlled the state value. Okay, so let's write, first of all, set alert. That is the name of our method. And then in this case, I would like to, first of all, pass the property and set it equal to true. Because remember, I do have the object with the property of show, and initially it is false. However, since I would like to display the alert, because remember that was the functionality, well, only when the alert show was in fact passed in, only then we displayed the alert. So that's the reason why I'm passing in the show with the value of true. And then I'm grabbing both of the properties, type and text, and setting them in the object that I already had. And initially, of course, I didn't have those properties. All right. That's number one. And then also, as you notice, when we're working with alerts, I would want to show them for, let's say, whatever time. In my case, I believe it was like 7 seconds. And then I would want to remove them. Now, the way we're going to do that, we're going to use set timeout function that comes with JavaScript. So let's write set timeout. And then within set timeout, we pass in the callback function. That's number one. And then also we need to set up, well, in how long we're going to call this particular function, correct? So in how long we're going to call this set timeout callback function. And like I said, in my case, I went with 7 seconds. This might be a little bit too long for tutorial. So I'm going to set it up as 3 seconds. And then within my callback function, what I'm going to do is again call set alert. However, in this case, we're going to set our object property of show to a false again. So what I'm saying is once I call set alert, I would like to display that particular alert. And the reason for that, because I have my property value of show to be equal to true. But then since I would like to hide it again, I'm going to call set alert one more time, the function that controls that particular state value, and set it equal back to false. Because once it's equal to false, well, alert is not going to be displayed. All right. Now let's save it. And now let's decide when we would like to call this handle alert. Well, first of all, I would like to call it if I successfully add the item. Okay. That would make sense where the user can clearly know that, yes, successfully we added the item. So right after the, let's say, set charge and set amount, or we can do before, doesn't really matter. We can just call our handle alert function. And I'm sorry, I keep referencing them as methods because, again, when we work with class-based components, of course, we're referencing them as methods, but of course, they're functions. So my apologies, handle alert. And then we're going to go with, in fact, passing in the object. And for the object, remember, we had two things, two properties that we needed to pass. What would be the type and what would be, in fact, the text. So for the type, like I said, since in my app CSS, I have two types. I have either danger and success, one for the green background and the other one for, in fact, the red background. Well, for this type, I'm going to say success because we successfully added the item. And then comma, and the other property name was text. And in this case, what text we would like to display? Well, let's just type item added, like so. And then once we have added our handle alert, let's test it out. So again, I'm going to go with rent, like I said, because it is the fastest. Let's go with 2 grand. And as you can see right now, my alert is displayed. And after 3 seconds, of course, it is gone because again, we call our set alert. So that is if we successfully added the item. However, we also have an option where, let's say we would like to let our user know that, hey, you know what, buddy, you need to, in fact, fill this out correctly because let's say one of the items is missing. So the way we do that is if one of them is, let's say, empty string or less than 0, of course, we have our else because we're running our if else statement. And then in this case, let's again call the handle alert. Again, we're going to pass in the object. And again, we have our property by the name of type. However, in this case, I would like to set my type equal to danger. And then as far as a text is concerned, let's write a little bit longer string. So let's write charge const, and let me write this properly. And you know what? In order to do this, I'm going to have to set this up as backticks. My apologies. I should have said that. It's going to be a little bit easier. Charge can't be empty value and amount value has to be bigger than 0. Okay. Something like that. Let's save it. And then now once I try to submit my form with empty values, we're going to get our error where we're going to say, you know what, charge cannot be empty value, and the value has to be bigger than 0. Okay. If we successfully submit the form, if we say rent and we add our item with 200, of course, we're going to have our alert set up correctly. Okay. Now, like I said, I would like to go over again what we just did. First and foremost, we did set up a new state value by the name of alert, as well as we have our function because we're using use state. Our initial value was the object with a property of show and the value of false. Now we're using that in our return, where I'm always checking, well, what is the property in my value? Is the show, in fact, true or false? Only if it is true, then I would like to display my alert. And then as I'm displaying the alert, well, I would like to access, in fact, the property of type as well as the property of text. And then within the alert, we're accessing both of them. And the way we're using the type, well, we're just checking in the CSS what class we would like to add. Because within the alert, I set it equal to the type, and then either I have alert and alert type danger or success. And then, of course, I also have the property of text or the prop of text that is being displayed. Now, lastly, within the app.js, if we head over app, we can see that we have our handle alert. Within the handle alert, we pass in again object with two properties, one by the name of type, the other one text, and then we use our set alert functionality, where in this case we set show to true because we would like to display, of course, our alert. That's number one. And then we add both of the properties, one for type and the second one for text. And of course, after that, we would like to remove our alert. So that's the reason why we call set timeout with a callback function. And within our callback function, we remove our alert because we set our object show property equal to the false. And we would like to do that in 3 seconds. But as always, you can change this time around. Now, lastly, like I said, once we are submitting the form, we call this handle alert function 2 times. One for, in fact, if the submission has been successful. And in this case, we're typing in the success as well as the text of item Adam. And then, of course, if there are some errors, well, we are displaying handle alert. However, in this case, we are using type for the danger and then whatever text we would like to display. Our application is coming along really well. However, we still need to take care of 3 functionalities. One for deleting all the items, second for deleting a single item, as well as the editing item. Okay. Now, the way we're going to do that in this video, we're going to take care of clearing all the items. However, since we're going to pass it into expense list and then also within the expense item, I would like to set up my functions right now as placeholders so we can take care of passing in them as props. And then once we do that, then in next videos, we're going to take care of functionality. I just don't see the point of setting up the function, then again, heading over to each and every component and passing them down as props. I think we can do it in one video. So in this case, let's call this clear all items. And as a side note, yes, there's going to be a few more state values as well. But for now, we're only going to care about the functionality, meaning we're going to set up our functions, okay? Or let's say more precisely, we're going to set up the placeholders. So let's just say const clear items. That is my function. And for the time being, again, I'm just going to leave it as an empty placeholder because I would like to do the functionality at the end of this video. Okay. So we can even say console log cleared all items. Okay. Now that is our clear items function. Then, like I said, we also need to take care of deleting a single item as well as editing the single item. So let's call this handle delete. And for both of them, remember when we worked within the expense item, we still had this ID prop, correct? Well, meaning we destructured from the expense prop that was coming down from the expenses, and we got our ID variable. And currently we're not using it. So the way we're going to set up our functionality when we're running, in fact, handle delete, well, we're going to grab that particular ID value. Okay. So let's write const handle delete, and then within this function, we're going to pass the ID that is available to us within the expense item. Okay. Now it is going to be a our own function. And then again, for the time being, let's just write console log and let's just say item deleted. And let's in fact look for that particular ID. So let's write here colon, then we know we can access it. And let's just say ID. Now the same we're gonna do for handle edit. So again, let me copy with in fact the comments as well. And let's just change it. Handle edit, that is the name of the function. And by the way, edit probably is going to have the most sophisticated functionality out of all this project, meaning there's going to be few moving parts. So it's probably going to be the longest one. And then item not deleted, item edited. Okay. Now we have all these functions. Like I said, I would like to pass them into expense list and then later into expense item. So the way we're going to do that is in fact, we're going to head over to expense list and then let's set up more props. So the first one is going to be handle delete, and of course, order doesn't matter. And then let's write also handle edit is equal to a handle edit. And last but not least, let's also pass in clear items with a prop name of clear items. Okay. Now I do have this particular setup. Then within the expense item, well, I would like to grab them. So one by one, let's again get handle edit, handle delete, and then handle clear items. Clear items. And then clear items function, we are going to run within the expense form, correct? And you know what? I'm sorry, I right away went to expense item. My bad. We're not looking for clear items here. My apologies, and we haven't passed them down. So let me save for now the expense item. We are still going to access handle edit and handle delete, but what we really need is expense list. My apologies. So we passed it from the app.js into expense list. And first and foremost, why don't we grab them from the expense list? So let's write handle edit, handle delete, and then clear items. And in this case, we're going to run clear items when we click on the clear expenses button. So clear expenses button is sitting within the expense list. So the way we set this up is by having a on click handle. So on click, and for the time being, we're just gonna run clear items, and we should see in a console items deleted or something like that. So let's open up the console just so we can see that, of course, our functionality, at least initial one, works. Yes, once I click it, I have clear items. So that's all good. And then remember, we iterated over our items array and then we passed it into the item. So I also would like to do the same thing with both of my functions, where I'm going to grab the handle delete and I'm going to set it equal to handle delete. The same faith is going to be for the handle edit, where I'm going to have the prop by the name of handle edit, and I'm going to pass it down into the item. Now, last but not least, remember we already destructured because I made a mistake, meaning I started working already right away within the expense item. And as you can see, since we're passing them as props, well, I right away have access to them. Now, for the button that has the edit, I would like to add the on click handler. So let's write on click handler, and it is going to be equal to our handle edit function. However, in this case, remember, we are looking for our ID, correct? That was our functionality, where we have the handle edit as well as handle delete. And in both of them, we are in fact passing in the ID because, of course, we're going to have to look for that particular item. Now, the problem is I can write technically like this. Basically, I can invoke it right away, but it doesn't make sense because I only want to run handle edit when in fact I click on the button. Now, the reason why I need to invoke it, because I do need to get my ID, correct? So the way we're going to set up this particular function is, in fact, there's going to be an arrow function. And as a return from the arrow function, well, we're going to get our handle edit. So that way we only run handle edit once we click on our particular button. Okay. Now the same I would like to do, in fact, for my delete button. So the difference is, of course, the fact that I'm going to run my handle delete function. Now, the same way again, I have my arrow function and I pass in handle delete, and let's look for the ID. Now, again, I always like to test it out first because there's no point for me to set up the functionality if, let's say, I made some kind of mistake when I was passing them as props. So let's test it out. Once we click on it, as you can see, I have item deleted, ID that's coming from UUID. And then let's say if we click on the third one, I can see item edited and as well string that's coming from UUID. Awesome. Everything works as far as the setup really, really well. So why don't we lastly set up the functionality where we clear the items? So if I click on the clear expenses, well, I would like to clear the list. And this is going to be probably the most straightforward functionality that you're going to see. Because remember, we had our set expenses, correct? All the way on top, we have our initial array with, in fact, set expenses function. Now, since we know that set expenses function controls, in fact, our array, well, it is very simple. Where once we click on clearing the items, I'm going to run set expenses function. And then within this particular function, I'm going to pass in the empty array since I would like to clear all the expenses. And that's it. That's all there is to it. So I have my 3 items, I clean the expenses, and that's it. All the expenses are gone. Now, of course, we haven't set up yet the local storage. So if I refresh, of course, I'm still getting my initial value. But in general, it is as straightforward as it gets. So we have our expenses, we have our button. Once we click on the button, well, we just clear all the expenses. Once we have our functionality for clearing all the items, next one up, we are going to set the handle delete. Okay. Now, first and foremost, why don't we get rid of the console log? And now let's think about it. So we have the array, correct? And once we click on deleting, we are getting our particular ID. So what we could do is, since it is the array, and is my initial expenses, I could use the filter method where we're going to iterate over the array. And in fact, we're going to return only the items that don't match that particular ID. Since once I click on it, I would like to remove that item. So let's set this up where, again, let's scroll down. Where's handle delete? There you are. I'm going to set up a variable and let's call this temp expenses like so. And we are using our expenses array that's coming from the state. Then, like I said, we're using filter method. Within the filter method, we are passing in the callback function that is being applied for each and every item in the array. And I'm going to set up right now that particular item. So again, I'm just using some kind of parameter and I named it item that reflects each and every item in this array. And what I'm saying here is if that particular item ID for that particular item matches, in fact, the ID that we're passing in, because remember, each and every item in our array, even the ones that, in fact, we added ourselves, well, they still have this ID property, correct? So what I'm saying, if you, the item in that array, if your ID does not match the ID that I'm passing in, well, then you're going to be returned into my temp expenses. However, the item that has the matching ID, well, it's not going to be in this temp expenses. Now, just to show you, we can, of course, console log it, just so we know that for sure it is working. Temp expenses, like so. And then let's decide what we would delete. I don't know. Why don't we go with rent? So once we click on it, of course, it is staying in a list because we haven't set up our functionality where we altered our initial expenses list. However, if we're going to head over to our console, you'll notice that instead of array of 3, we have array of 2. And you're also going to see that your first item in this case is going to be what? Well, it is going to be the car payment, which in fact was the second one. So the only thing left is in fact changing our initial array or expenses item in the state. So let's just call set expenses because again, that is the function that controls this particular value. Then we set it equal to temp expenses. And in this case, I don't have to do anything special because I'm already getting back my array. Because remember, the whole deal was before that, first of all, we needed to use the spread operator. And second, we needed to have array to begin with. Or in this case, when we're using the filter method, well, we get the array anyway. And you know what? We could also maybe have the handle alert. And then within this handle alert, why don't we set type of, let's say danger, just so it's red. And as a text, we can go with item deleted. Okay. And you know what? While we're at it, I can still do the same thing with clearing the items. So let's copy and paste it. However, in this case, we can say all items deleted. Something like this. All items deleted. Now, I don't think I need a console right now. Or let's check it out how we can delete items. So let's go first, I guess, with rent. So notice we have item deleted. Of course, we deleted the item. Can do the same thing for the third one. And then, of course, once I refresh, I get all of them back. And we can still check it out, clearing all the items where I have all items deleted. So successfully, we have functionality for both clearing all the items and then, in fact, deleting one single item. All right. Right after our easy functions, we're going to work on our handle edit, which, like I said, is going to be the most complicated functionality in the sense that it will, in fact, have a lot of moving parts. Now, first and foremost, let's head over to our state where we're setting up our state values, and let's add two more. One by the name of edit, like so, and then the other one is going to be an ID or edit item, however you'd like to call it. Edit item. Okay. Now, then let's again use the use state and let's grab two values. One for edit. So let's write also the function right away. Set edit, function that controls it. And let's set this equal to use state and initially pass false. Because as you can see, we're not editing any items. So that's the reason why we go right away with false. Then also, as far as edit item, again, the same old spiel. We have our state value, which I'm going to call it ID, as well as set ID that controls it. All right. Now, again, we use state, and as the initial value, we pass in the 0. That's number one. Then also, if you look at my finished application, you'll notice that if we add rent, and let's go again with not rent 300, but let's do 3000. If we click on the edit, we also change the submit button text. So notice before that we had submit, and now in fact we have edit. So we're signaling to the user that we are in fact editing the item. All right. Now, in order to do that, we're going to have to head over again back to our return. And then within the return, as you see, we have our expense form. That is our component. And I'm going to set up one more prop here. And the prop name is going to be edit. And I'm going to set it equal to my state value by the same name. All right, edit. And then where is our form? Here it is. All the way on the top, we are already destructuring. So one more destructure by the name of edit prop. And then we'll head over to our button. And then within the button, again, we're going to set up the expression where if edit is going to be true, so the state value is going to be true, then in fact, we're going to display a text of edit instead of submit. So the way it's going to work, I have my edit. I'm going to check whether it is true or false. If it is true, I'm going to say the button is going to have a text of edit. If in fact it's going to be false, well, then I'm going to say submit. Of course, initially I have it as false. So of course, that's the reason why I have submit. But if we're going to head over back and let's say change this to true, you'll notice that right now our submit button is going to have the edit. So this is exactly what's going to happen once we click on this particular button. All right. Now let me change it back to false. All right. Then let's start working slowly on our functionality. So we have our function handle edit here. And then for the time being, I'm going to leave the console because we were going to console log something out, but not the ID. Okay, let's delete this. But we do have access to ID. So what would be the reasoning? How we would do this? Well, we could, in fact, again, iterate over our array, find what is the item that has this particular ID, and then we're going to go from there. So first of all, let me set up, in fact, the variable. I'm going to call this expense, and we're going to set it equal to, again, the expenses value in a state. It is the array, so I could use the find method. Now, within the find method, again, we pass in the callback function. Now, this callback function is being applied for each and every item in my array. And in fact, as a parameter, I'm accessing each and every item. Now, I'm going to call this item, but again, we could call this banana. It doesn't really matter. Again, it is a parameter at the end of the day. So I'm going to call this item, and I'm going to say if you item have the ID that matches the ID that I'm passing in the handle edit, meaning for each and every item that I'm clicking, well, then please return this particular item. So if this is true, if item ID matches the ID, well, then our expense item is going to be, in fact, that particular item. All right. Now, just to, in fact, again, see whether our functionality works correctly right now, let's look for our expense. So if I click on the car payment in my console, I should see the item, of course, by the name of car payment. And I do have my object. And sure enough, what is the charge? I could even zoom in just so you can believe me. And yes, the, of course, value is the car payment. All right, awesome. Now what? Well, we know that we have the object. However, I could right away destructure two things because my point right now is following, where once I click on it, once I get my object with, let's say, this item, the car payment, I would like to add both of these values here within my input. And remember, when we were setting up our state, what were the values that were controlling that? Well, I had the charge, correct? As well as I had the amount. And I have both of them with functions, correct? I have set charge and set amount. So what we could do right now is, in fact, following, where I could, first of all, destructure two properties out of my expense object. First one, I'm going to look for charge. And the second one, I'm going to look for the amount. And again, the syntax here is the destructuring, where I could assign this, of course, to variables, but I could right away say, hey, listen, I would like to have a variable that holds the value from my object. And the value I'm looking for is the charge as well as the amount. So I'm setting this equal to my object. That's number one. And then, like I said, let's use both of the functions that we have. So let's use set charge and let's pass in the charge value. So instead of using, let's say, on change handler, when we were changing this value, in this case, I just change it straight out, where I say, oh, no, let's run set charge and let's set it equal to whatever value I have here. And the same thing I can do with set amount, where instead of charge, I'm going to set this equal to amount. Well, that's number one. And also here, I'm going to write amount. Again, I'm accessing value from my particular object that is going to reflect to whatever item I clicked on. Of course, that's not what I would like. In fact, I just want to show you, of course, my console, where if I have my object, well, the amount is 400, correct? That's the reason why I'm using set amount and setting to 400. And the charge or the name of the actual expense is car payment. And that's the reason why we're using set charge. Now, lastly, I would like to do two things. Remember when we set up our two state values, one for editing and the other one for the ID. So now in this case, I would like to also run both of these functions, one for set edit. And in this case, I would like to pass it as true, because what is going to happen once we click on it? First of all, we are going to add both of these values in the inputs, one for charge and the other one for amount. And I also would like to change the text within the button to edit to signal to a user that we are in fact editing. Okay, that's number one. Now, second, we're gonna need this particular ID as well, because obviously once we edit the item, we would like to place it in the same place where it was within the list. Okay, I wouldn't want to change the list. So I'm gonna have to have access to this particular item. And the way we can do that, again, we can use our set ID. Remember, we have the ID value in a state, and I could use not set edit, sorry, set ID. And in this case, I'm going to pass in the ID. So basically, the ID that I'm getting as a parameter in my handle edit. Now, remember, it was the state value. So now, once we do that, we should have two things. First of all, we're going to change the state value to a true. That's number one. And second, we're also going to change here both the values in the input, or I'm sorry, I guess three things. And lastly, we're also going to change the value for our ID. So now let's test it out. First of all, let's look for, let's say, car payment. Now, the moment we click on the edit button, we notice two things. First of all, I can see that for my input, I do have right now my car payment. And for the amount, I'm going to have 400. Now, I also have the text within the edit button changed to edit. Now, the thing though is because we haven't set up any kind of functionality within our handle submit, notice we're still using the same functionality. What is going to happen? Well, we're going to add this item to the end of our list. Okay. So essentially, we're just adding the same item. So we're going to fix that in a second. Don't worry about it. But I do want to show you that still our functionality works where I am accessing exactly the same item. So I access the same item, and if I'm going to do something that I'm not supposed to, let's say delete amount, I'm not going to be able to, in fact, submit it. Okay, so that functionality still works. Now, the problem is, of course, that we need to come up with functionality where, in fact, we're editing the item, because currently we're just adding them to a list. All right, so how it is going to work. First of all, let's head over to our handle submit. Okay, we already have some kind of functionality, but we're going to change this a little bit around. So first of all, if both of the values are true in the sense of what I'm looking for, meaning if the charge is not equal to an empty string and the amount is equal to 0, well, I would like to submit it. But within this if, I will also set up one more if statement where I'm going to check what is the current state value of edit. Okay, because I know since all the way in the bottom, if I know that my state edit value is true because we ran the set edit function and passed the value of true, well, in that case, I know that I am in fact editing. All right. So again, we go back, we just check whether in fact everything is correct, whether we have some kind of text and whether the amount is bigger than 0. And also right away, we check, well, are we editing or are we not? And of course, at this point, once we click on the button, we are editing. So the edit in the state is going to be true. So I'm going to say, all right, if we are editing, first and foremost, I would like to set up the functionality where, again, we're going to iterate over this particular array. Now, if we're not editing, then in fact, we're going to do already our submission. So remember, previously we had already our submit. So let's grab both of these, the single expense as well as set expense. Now, I'm going to leave the set charge and set amount outside this else for the very simple reason that for both of them, for editing as well as for just a simple, straightforward submission, I would like to set charge and set amount back to empty values. Okay, and that's the reason why I'm going to place set charge and set amount back to strings, and I'm not placing them within the if and else. Okay, I'm just placing it within my first if statement. So I know if I have the correct values, if the charge is more than an empty string and amount is bigger than 0, well, I know I'm operating within this first if statement. Okay, and else also is going to stay the same. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to set up the functionality where we are editing the item. So how it's going to look like? Well, first I'm going to say that there's going to be a variable, and the variable is going to be set expenses. And our issue is following, where I would like to edit the item. So if I'm editing the item, I would like to place it in exactly the same spot where it was in the list. So for that, I'm going to use expenses array, and I'm going to use the map method. And again, we're going to iterate over the array. We're going to apply the callback function for that particular array. However, again, we have the parameter that reflects each and every item in the array. And the functionality is following, where if the item matches the ID that I have in a state. And remember, we set our state ID value by using set ID function, correct? So if the item matches that particular ID, well, then we're going to use a spread operator with an object, and we're just going to change some values around. So in this case, what I'm saying like this, if return, and now I would like to check whether ID of the item matches the ID that is sitting within a state. Again, please remember that is sitting within a state because we had a variable there, correct? So if it is matching, then I have the ternary operator, where if it is matching, then I have one functionality. If it is not matching, then we have a different functionality. So if my ID does not match, well, I'm just going to return the item as it is. Okay, because remember, the first thing was for true, and the second one is for the false. So if the ID that's sitting within the state that we're controlling with set ID does not match the ID that each and every item has, or that particular item has, well, then just return the item. However, if the item does match, first of all, return the item. And as you see, we are using the spread operator with an object where I'm grabbing all the properties that that object is already have, but I would like to change two of them. And those two are going to be the charge as well as the amount. And we can just change them by saying, you know what, charge is going to be whatever charge I have in the state. And again, since it is ES6, we can just skip it and we can say for both of them. So we're returning a object and we are spreading out all the properties that that particular object has. However, if I would like to override something, I'm just going to have to access that particular property and override it with new value. Again, we're overriding from the state. So I could write something like this, but it's just a little bit faster if I say override the charge property as well as the amount property. All right. Now, lastly, remember we had set expenses, where in fact we had set expenses. That was our function that controlled the array. And of course, again, we have 10 expenses. Now, last thing that we're going to do is in fact use set edit, because we need to make sure that set edit is back to false. So let's set it equal back to false. And if you really want, you could technically set the ID to 0 or some kind of initial value, but it doesn't really matter because once we're going to run again our handle edit, remember all the way in the bottom we had our handle edit. Well, once we're going to run it, we're going to override it anyway. So it doesn't really matter as long as you set up the functionality where you make sure that set edit is set to false. Now let's save it. We do have our initial ones and we can right away test it out. So I have my car payment and I can click on the edit. Notice I have my charge as well as the amount. And let's say my car payment went from 400 to a 4,000. I just add it and make sure that you do everything correctly. So don't delete everything because we're going to have our alert in that case. And then let's just click on it. Let's say edit. And then in this case, as you notice right away, my car payment went from 400 to a 4,000 as well as my total was affected. Now, also, if you really want, you could add the handle alert. So we can do this way where we copy and paste. We have our success and let's say item edited. Edited. Can also do it this way if you would like to. Again, why don't we change it back? And of course, the moment we refresh, since again, we're not using local storage yet, it's back to 400. So again, let's change this sucker to 4,000 and I can see item edited. And of course, my car payment is 4,000 right now. Now, if you want to edit it one more time, again, let's go with car payment and let's just change it to a house payment, something like that. Let's edit it and it's still sitting within the same space. Now, we could have used the filter method, and of course, that's not the only way how we can set up this functionality where we can filter it out. But my main goal was so the item stays within the same order. Okay, so the list doesn't change the order. And that's it. That's how we can add handle edit. Our application works really well. The only problem is that we are not persisting our data. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, each and every time I'm going to refresh the browser. In fact, well, I'm going to get my initial items. But let's say, even though I'm going to add something, Let's go again with the rent. Yes, I have 4 items. And again, the moment we refresh the browser, well, that particular item is gone. Okay, again, we're not persisting our data. Now, in order to fix that, we could use the local storage API that comes from the browser. So let me show you how it's going to look like in my finished application. Again, if I open up the developer tools, we head over to application tab, and then within the application tab, we look for the local storage. And then within the local storage, well, we can save our key value pairs. Now, one thing we need to remember is the fact that we need to save them as strings. So as you see right now, I have the key by the name of expenses, and the value is going to be, in fact, my array. Now, of course, I'm going to be updating my array. So in order to do that, we're going to use the use effect. So that's going to be the second hook we're going to look at. But for the time being, of course, we can use our initial array. All right. And what this shows me is that I have my item. As you see, I have my array, and within the array, I have my object. So if I'm going to add another one, let's say car payment, and I'm going to set this equal to, I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000. And you know what? In this case, of course, I clicked on edit. So that's the reason why I'm going to change the initial one. But let's write right now rent, I guess. And then rent is going to be 10 grand. Then, of course, I'll have one more item in my list. All right. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's head over to our application. Let's open up the browser developer tools. And you'll notice that within our application, well, we have nothing. Correct. So within the local storage, there is no key value pair. Now, the way we set up our key value pairs, we use local storage, and is right away available to us. And then we have 2 methods. One for getting the item, and the second one is for setting the item. However, again, remember, we need to store them as a strings. So we're also going to have to use, in fact, JSON parse or JSON stringify. So first of all, let's start with our initial expenses. So I'm going to comment all this out like so. That's step number 1, just so you can have it for your own reference. But we're going to change our initial expenses. We're going to go with const initial expenses. Again, let's call it exactly the same. And let's use our local storage that is available to us. And like I said, the method name is going to be get item. Now, in this case, I'm going to run the ternary operator, where I'm going to look for item by the name of expenses. Now, of course, currently we don't have it. That's straight out of the bat. There is no expenses you can clearly see within our application. But what I'm doing right now is essentially checking. So if that item, expenses item, is in fact in my local storage, well, then the first option for us is true, correct? Because we are running our ternary operator. However, if it doesn't exist, well, I'm just going to return a actual empty array. So I'm going to set my initial expenses equal to an empty array. However, if that item, the expenses item, is in my local storage, well, then, like I said, I would like to return it. However, the thing is, I'm going to be storing it as a string. So first and foremost, like I said, we need to run JSON parse to parse our string. And then again, we're going to access local storage. Then we're going to get our item. And again, we're going to look for expenses. Okay. So that's step number 1. And obviously, the moment we run it, well, we get an empty array because there is no item within the local storage by the name of expenses. So that's our initial setup. And once we're done getting the items from the local storage, we're going to have to work on functionality where we are setting the items in our local storage. Excellent. We are getting our items from local storage, but we also would like to come up with a way to set them in the local storage as well. And in order to do that, we are going to use another hook by the name of use effect. So here are some key points about use effect. Essentially, it is a function that runs after each render. And the first parameter it receives is a callback function that gets to be invoked after each render. And the second one is array that lets React know whether to run the use effect in the first place. All right. Now, first and foremost, we're going to have to, in fact, import it from React. Like I said, name is use effect and it is named import. That's step number 1. then we're gonna have to head over to our app component. And again, it doesn't really matter where, unless we're doing that in return. That is obviously not allowed, but anywhere here. And you know what? I'm gonna do it right after the state. Okay, so I have my state functionality, but I'm also gonna set up a use effect. So I'm gonna copy and paste it, and I'm just gonna set it here, use effect. But again, please remember, we could set this up anywhere. Now, like I said, it is a function, so we call it use effect. And then within the effect, we pass in the first parameter, the callback function that is going to be called after each render. And here I would like to do two things. First of all, I'm going to console log it. We called use effect just because I would like to show you something in a second. In a second, remember we had our local storage API, correct? So we can write local storage. Then in order to set the item, we're going to go with set item. Now the name that we are looking for is the expenses. So that's the reason why we're going to set the item also by the same name, expenses. Please understand that if the main names don't match, then of course our functionality is not going to work. And then lastly, remember we had to stringify it because we needed to store it as a string. So I'm going to go with JSON, stringify, and then within the stringify, I'm going to pass in my expenses array. And expenses array is, of course, coming from my state. All right. So that's step number one. Now I'm not going to look in the console yet. I just want to show you that functionality is going to work. So let's say again, I'm going to start with the rent. Rent is going to be 2,500. I added my rent item. Awesome. Everything works. Then let's add car payment. Then again, let's set this equal to a 400. And again, item is being added to my list. Now, the moment we're gonna refresh, in fact, the browser, both of the items are there because we are using right now the local storage where in fact we're checking. We're like, you know what? If the expenses are there, awesome. Then just get me this value of this expenses. So if we're gonna, I don't know, edit it, it also is gonna stay in a list. Because if we're gonna go for a much better car, let's say the car payment that is 4,000, still, once we refresh the browser, awesome, we still have our list because we are using our local storage, and in fact, we are using our use effect. Now, here's the kicker though. Why I did talk about the second parameter, in fact, the array? Well, the answer is very simple. If we're gonna open up again our tools, so again, that's not what I wanted. Let me head over to my developer tools, and then within the console, well, you'll notice that we call the effect. Okay, that's number one. But if I'm gonna start adding, let's say, more items, and I'm gonna type, I don't know, I had rent, I had car payment, I don't know, boat payment. So I have called already use effect 4 times. Okay, then if I'm gonna add that the boat payment is 3,000, again, I called use effect even more times. Now, once I submit it, I called use effect. Then once I'm gonna click on edit, I'm calling a use effect. And as you can see, there's really no need for us to call this use effect so many times. So why we're calling this use effect so many times? Well, because when we're working with React, when does React re-renders the component? Well, we have two options. Either the state has changed or the props changed. Now, what happens in our case? Notice we have all these state values. We have for the expenses, we have for charge, we have for amount, and each and every time we are changing the value in a state, effectively, we are calling use effect. And that is, in fact, not necessary. And what's even more, when you're going to use effect when fetching data, this is the worst thing possible because you're just going to get your infinite re-render because you're going to fetch your data, you're going to set up in a state, and then the moment the value is going to change in a state, again, effectively, you're going to call use effect, and so on and so forth. So, in order to avoid that, remember the second parameter, we had our array. Now, if you just leave the array empty, what's going to happen? Well, it's just going to run one time like you would have with component and mount. So we're just going to run it, and that's it. Now, just to show you, notice again, we called use effect, and I can do whatever I would like to do right now in my inputs. I'm not calling the use effect. Okay. Now, our problem is that we would like to call use effect when in fact we change our expenses. So when we add one more expense. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to set up in my array that I would like to call use effect when there are some changes in my expenses value in the state. Okay. And now everything is going to run correctly because we're going to run it first time when the compound mount. All right. That's fine. But then we're only going to call it if we add the proper item to our list. So let's say item number, I don't know, 4, and then let's add, I don't know, 5,000, something like that. Only then we run the call effect. And as you can see, once I click on edit, in fact, I don't run it. Only when the changes are applied to my list, only then we run the use effect. So that's how we can use effect as well as use state, both hooks from React, in order to set up our budget calculator application. I hope you guys enjoy the project, and I hope to see you on our next projects.